A lot of the advice that we're being given around anxiety, I think, is coming from the perspective of those of us who are not neurologically diverse. And I was wondering about, does this make sense? It kind of seems like a one-size-fits-all approach, and we know that doesn't work, right? We know that there has to be mass customization out there for coping skills and supports. So I kind of bounced the idea off with Sharon, and she thought it was a good idea. So we've come up with a little bit of an idea of a series of table talks where we're going to chat about the differences and similarities for those of us who are either responding to situational anxiety and stress and pressures, those of us who are neurologically diverse or have a diagnosis who are responding, and how we can learn from each other and support each other a little more fully. So Sharon, why don't you maybe share with us some of the skills that you've developed or some of the differences that you see in terms of those who have been given a diagnosis and those who haven't in terms of responding to the current situation of COVID-19?
Well, I think for me, it's been really interesting because as somebody with a diagnosis, and again, first of all, those of us with diagnoses, it's all different. So in other words, there's not going to be one standard response. And what's happening is when we're talking about anxiety, I think you're very accurate. A lot of this is about how most people are experiencing situational anxiety. And if they're not, someone with a diagnosis, it is a very much in the moment kind of thing. Those of us with a diagnosis, we're used to being anxious about things or having anxiety and panic attacks about things that other people don't seem anxious about. We can be set off differently, and again, depending on what our background is. So what's interesting is about something like this is that honestly, and it's funny because everybody in my family, there's 4 or 5 of us that all have different anxiety-based diagnoses. We sat around the dinner table on Friday night going, we can't understand why everybody that's neurologically normal is freaking out right now, yet we're the people with the anxiety disorders. Aren't we supposed to be freaking out? Now, don't get me wrong. There are some folks that, again, depending on what their diagnosis is, especially if it's something related to OCD, or if you're somebody that, again, anybody that's got a propensity for hoarding, that's tied to anxiety. So this is definitely going to be triggering certain folks. But what we're noticing was that, honestly, because this is a mass situation,
right?
It's actually, this is our sweet spot. This is like, oh, okay, this is not a me thing. This is a collective thing. And interestingly enough, many of us can actually become the calm within the storm. And example, like as my time as health minister, and there's science that backs this up, those of us with lived experience are actually better crisis managers because we learned how to deal with this stuff in our head. And now that it's actually happening out in the real world, we've got insight into things. So like, again, my ability to plan strategically, that was a very useful skill as a health minister in general. But again, having been the one that dealt with the Ebola protocols. So right now I'm looking at things through the balance of, again, lived experience in terms of health minister status, but also lived experience in terms of anxiety, and those two mesh. So I think we actually do have to teach each other. And I do think that that we're going to have to navigate that language that says anxiety in this broader thing and doesn't necessarily distinguish between the neurologically normative going through something situational, and then those of us with a diagnosis for whom, yes, this might be amping things up, but also in some cases might actually be the, oh my gosh, this is my jam. I can do this. Like, I can be useful right now. And that's the stuff that I'm putting out to leadership right now is like, oh my God, this is my thing. I actually had a girlfriend saying, you probably missed the fact that you're not health minister right now. I'm like, yes, I do, because this is exactly my skill set. Like, give me a problem to solve. My anxiety is my superpower. And it actually is what keeps me from thinking myself into a hole and hoarding toilet paper.
Absolutely. And one of the amazing things about having a friend who was not only in politics, I knew Sharon when she was health minister, gave me a completely different insight into the background and workings of government at that level. Because for those of us who are in the mainstream, like, Joe or Jane six-pack, we don't often have an awareness of what goes on behind. And sort of like, knowing you and some other folks at the time who were in those positions, being able to just view that socially, I was like, wow, okay, that's a little bit intense. So it's amazing having someone with your skill set who can actually say, listen, I have been in that seat. I have made these decisions. I know what's going on.